February 17, 1843, the sun beats down mercilessly on the dusty plains of Sindh in what is now Pakistan. A British general stands before an army of 22,000 warriors. He commands just 2,800 men. The odds are nearly 8 to 1 against him. His officers whisper that this is madness, that they should retreat, that they cannot possibly win. The general turns to them with steel in his eyes and says, "We have no choice but to fight and we will win." 3 hours later, the battlefield would be littered with 5,000 enemy dead. The British would lose just 62 men. This is the story of one of the most audacious military campaigns in British history, a conquest that would add 50,000 square miles to the British Empire in a matter of weeks and spark a controversy that echoes to this day. The man at the center of this extraordinary tale was Major General Sir Charles James Napier. And to understand what happened in Sindh in 1843, you need to understand the man himself. Because Charles Napier was unlike any other officer in the British Army. He was 60 years old when he arrived in India, ancient by military standards of the day. Most generals his age were enjoying retirement in comfortable country estates, reminiscing about past glories. Napier was just getting started on his greatest campaign. Born in 1782 into a distinguished military family, Napier had spent his entire adult life at war. His father was a colonel. His mother was Lady Sarah Lennox, a woman connected to some of the most powerful families in Britain. Military service was not just expected in the Napier family, it was practically mandatory. Charles joined the army at age 12 as an ensign, which was common for aristocratic boys of that era. But unlike many wealthy officers who bought their commissions and treated military service as a social obligation, Napier took it seriously from the beginning. He studied military history obsessively. He learned languages including French, Spanish, and later Hindustani and Persian. He read everything he could find about warfare, from ancient Greek and Roman tactics to the campaigns of Frederick the Great and Napoleon. While other young officers were gambling and drinking, Napier was in his quarters reading Xenophon and Caesar, analyzing how ancient commanders had won battles against superior numbers. His baptism of fire came early. In 1800, at age 18, he fought in Ireland during the rebellion. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, where Napier would prove his courage and nearly die in the process. He served in Portugal and Spain during the Peninsular War, fighting under Sir John Moore. In January 1809, at the Battle of Colonial, everything changed. The British army was retreating to the coast, pursued by French forces under Marshal Soult. Napier was commanding a company when they came under heavy attack. A musket ball struck him in the face, shattering his jaw. He kept fighting. A French cavalry saber sliced open his scalp. He still kept fighting. Then a French infantryman drove a bayonet completely through his body, the blade entering his back and emerging from his chest. Napier collapsed, bleeding from multiple wounds, his blood soaking into the Spanish mud. His men thought he was dead. He probably should have been dead. Most soldiers who suffered even one of those wounds would have died, but Napier had suffered all three simultaneously. He was left on the battlefield as the British retreated to their ships. French soldiers found him hours later still breathing somehow and took him prisoner. They were so impressed by his courage and the fact that he was still alive that they treated his wounds and eventually allowed him to return to British lines in a prisoner exchange. The recovery took months. His jaw never fully healed, giving him a slightly distorted appearance for the rest of his life. The bayonet wound should have killed him, had probably punctured organs, yet somehow he survived. These experiences shaped Napier profoundly. He had looked death in the face and survived. He had no fear of danger anymore, having already experienced the worst that war could offer. But he also developed a deep contempt for aristocratic officers who had never seen real combat, who treated warfare as a gentlemanly game, who knew nothing about actual fighting, but commanded men anyway because of their social connections. Napier believed that military rank should be earned through competence and courage, not purchased with family money. This attitude made him extremely unpopular with the British military establishment, who saw him as a dangerous radical. After recovering from his wounds, Napier returned to service. He fought in the War of 1812 against the United States, commanding troops in the burning of Washington, D.C., an action he later said he was ashamed of. He served in Bermuda as a garrison commander, where he built fortifications and improved the defenses of the island. Then he was sent to the Ionian Islands in Greece, where he served as governor and military commander for several years. His time in the Ionian Islands revealed another side of Napier, his administrative ability, and his relatively progressive views on social issues for his time. As governor, he built roads, improved sanitation, established schools, and tried to reduce corruption in the local government. He learned Greek and made genuine efforts to understand the local culture and customs. He also defended the rights of the local population against exploitation by British merchants and officials, which again made him enemies among the British establishment. He saw himself not just as a conqueror or administrator, but as someone who could improve people's lives through efficient, honest government. This paternalistic attitude was typical of Victorian imperialism, the belief that British rule was inherently beneficial to colonized peoples, but Napier seemed to take it more seriously than most of his contemporaries. By the early 1840s, Napier was in his late 50s. His career had been distinguished but controversial, and he expected to retire soon. Then came the disaster in Afghanistan. In 1839, the British had invaded Afghanistan, installing a puppet ruler and occupying Kabul. They thought they had achieved an easy victory. They were catastrophically wrong. In 1841, the Afghans rose in rebellion. The British garrison in Kabul, along with thousands of camp followers and families, attempted to retreat to India in the middle of winter. It was a massacre. Of approximately 1,500 people who left Kabul, only one man, Dr. William Bryden, reached the British garrison at Jalalabad. The rest were killed by Afghan warriors or died from cold and starvation. It was one of the worst military disasters in British history, a humiliation that shook the entire empire. The British government and the East India Company were desperate to restore their prestige and secure their northwestern frontier. They needed someone tough, someone experienced, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by difficult odds. They thought of Charles Napier. In 1842, they offered him command of the military forces in Sindh, a region on the Indus River that bordered Afghanistan. Napier accepted, perhaps sensing that this was his last chance for military glory, perhaps believing he could do some good, perhaps simply because he was a soldier and soldiers follow orders. He arrived in Sindh in late 1842 and immediately began planning what would become his most famous campaign. But to understand why the British wanted Sindh and why Napier was willing to conquer it, one must understand the geopolitical situation in South Asia in the 1840s. The British East India Company had been expanding its control over the Indian subcontinent for nearly a century. Through a combination of trade, diplomacy, and military conquest, they had taken control of Bengal, much of southern India, and large portions of the north. But there were still significant territories that remained independent or semi-independent. Sindh was one of these. It was not a unified state, but rather a collection of territories ruled by different amirs, Muslim princes, who governed their own domains and maintained their own military forces. The most powerful amirs were based in Hyderabad, controlling the lower Indus Valley. There were also amirs at Khairpur and Mirpur, each ruling their own territories with varying degrees of independence. These emirs had treaties with the British East India Company. In exchange for British protection and trade privileges, the emirs agreed to maintain friendly relations with the British and to allow British merchants to operate in their territories. The treaties also stipulated that the emirs would not have relations with foreign powers that were hostile to Britain. For the most part, the emirs had kept these agreements. Sindh had been relatively peaceful. Trade had been profitable for both sides, and there had been no major conflicts. But the disaster in Afghanistan changed everything. The British were paranoid about their northwestern frontier. They feared that Russia, the other great imperial power of the age, might try to expand southward through Central Asia into India. They feared that the Afghans, having just humiliated the British, might invade. They feared that local rulers who had witnessed British defeat might think the British Empire was weak and could be resisted. The British government wanted to secure every possible advantage along that northwestern frontier, and that meant controlling Sindh. The Indus River was strategically crucial. Control of the river meant control of a major transportation route and the ability to move troops and supplies quickly. Control of Sindh meant a secure buffer zone between British India and potentially hostile Afghanistan. But there was a problem. The emirs had not violated their treaties. They had not attacked British interests. They had not allied with British enemies. Under the existing agreements, the British had no legitimate reason to take direct control of Sindh. This is where Charles Napier came in. The Governor-General of India, Lord Ellenborough, wanted Sindh conquered, but he could not simply order an unprovoked invasion. That would be too blatant, too likely to cause political problems in London, too likely to encourage other Indian rulers to unite against British aggression. So the strategy was more subtle. Ellenborough gave Napier vague orders to secure British interests and maintain stability. He did not explicitly order conquest, but everyone understood what was expected. Napier was to create a situation where conquest would appear necessary or justified. Napier understood his role perfectly. In his private journals, which are a fascinating historical resource, he wrote with remarkable honesty about what he was doing. He wrote that the conquest of Sindh would be morally wrong, that the emirs had done nothing to deserve losing their territories, that Britain was acting like a bully and a thief. He called the impending conquest a crime. These are extraordinary admissions, rare examples of a colonial conqueror explicitly acknowledging the injustice of his actions, even as he planned to carry them out. But Napier also wrote that he believed British rule would ultimately benefit the people of Sindh, that the emirs were incompetent and corrupt rulers, and that British administration would bring order, justice, and progress. He convinced himself that even though the means were wrong, the end result would justify them. There is something deeply revealing about Napier's moral struggle. He represents a type of imperialist who was not ignorant or indifferent to the moral problems of conquest, but rather someone who acknowledged those problems and then rationalized them away. He told himself that he was serving a greater good, that British civilization was superior and had the right and duty to spread itself, that the immediate injustice of conquest would be redeemed by long-term benefits. This self-justification was common among Victorian imperialists, but Napier's written record of his internal debate is unusually explicit. He knew what he was doing was wrong by most moral standards, but he constructed a worldview in which it was also necessary and ultimately beneficial. When Napier arrived in Sindh, he immediately began a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation. He traveled extensively throughout the region, often in disguise or with minimal escort, personally observing the terrain, the cities, the fortifications, and the people. This was unusual behavior for a British general. Most senior officers stayed in comfortable headquarters and relied on reports from subordinates. Napier wanted to see everything with his own eyes. He visited markets and talked with merchants and farmers, learning about local conditions and opinions. He studied the emir's military forces, observing their training, their weapons, their tactics. He made detailed notes about everything he saw. What Napier discovered was a region with significant military forces but little modern military organization. The emirs could call upon tens of thousands of warriors, fierce fighters with experience in tribal conflicts and border skirmishes. But these forces were not trained in European military tactics. They did not fight in disciplined formations. They did not coordinate infantry, cavalry, and artillery effectively. Their weapons were mostly outdated, matchlock muskets and swords rather than modern rifles and artillery. Most importantly, they had no experience fighting against a European military force. They did not understand how devastating disciplined volley fire could be, how quickly European troops could maneuver and reform, how effectively European commanders could coordinate combined arms attacks. Napier also discovered that the emirs did not entirely trust each other and did not coordinate their military planning effectively. Each emir maintained his own military forces and made his own decisions. There was no unified command structure, no central strategic planning. This meant that even though the total military forces in Sindh were formidable, they would likely not act as a unified army. Napier could potentially defeat them one at a time, or exploit their divisions to reduce the forces he would face in any single battle. This intelligence was invaluable for his planning, but Napier needed more than intelligence. He needed a pretext for war. So in late 1842 and early 1843, the British began making new demands on the emirs. These demands were presented as revisions to the existing treaties, necessary updates to reflect the changed security situation after the Afghan War. But in reality, they were designed to be unacceptable, to create a crisis that would justify military action. The British demanded the right to station troops anywhere in Sindh they chose. They demanded that the emirs pay for the upkeep of these British troops. They demanded exclusive control over the Indus River and all trade along it. They demanded that the emirs submit all their foreign policy decisions to British approval. They demanded huge payments and compensation for alleged violations of previous agreements. These demands were outrageous. They would have effectively ended Sindh's independence even without formal annexation. The emirs would have been reduced to puppets, paying the British for the privilege of being occupied by British troops. The emirs protested. They sent delegations to British officials, arguing that they had kept the existing treaties faithfully, that these new demands violated the spirit and letter of the agreements, that they could not afford to pay what the British were demanding, that allowing foreign troops to station anywhere in their territories would undermine their authority with their own people. They pleaded for moderation, for negotiation, for some recognition of their dignity and their rights as independent rulers. The British response was ultimatums: accept the demands or face military action. There was no real negotiation, no attempt to find middle ground. Napier made it clear that he had a large military force ready to enforce British demands and that he would not hesitate to use it. He moved troops closer to the emirs' territories, conducting highly visible military exercises and demonstrations of British firepower. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. Some of the younger emirs and their military commanders were outraged and wanted to fight. Others were more cautious, understanding that they could not defeat the British in open warfare. For months, tension built as the emirs tried to find some way to preserve their independence without provoking a war they knew they could not win. In January 1843, the situation exploded. British residents, diplomatic representatives living in Hyderabad under the protection of treaty agreements, were attacked by some of the emir's followers. The historical record is unclear about exactly what happened and who was responsible. Some accounts suggest it was a spontaneous uprising by warriors who were furious about British demands. Other accounts suggest it was a deliberate provocation, possibly even encouraged by British agents who wanted to create an excuse for war. What is clear is that the British Residency was surrounded by hostile forces, though no British personnel were actually killed. It was threatening but not murderous, a display of anger rather than a massacre. Napier seized on this incident as his justification. He declared that the emirs had violated the treaties by attacking British representatives, that this was an act of war, and that he would now use force to secure British interests and punish the guilty parties. He sent an ultimatum to the emirs, declaring they must surrender immediately and submit to British authority or face military conquest. He gave them just days to respond. The emirs knew this was the crisis they had feared. They had a terrible choice: submit and lose their independence without a fight, losing all honor and authority in the eyes of their people, or resist militarily even though they were likely to lose. Different emirs made different decisions, but enough chose resistance to give Napier his war. The emirs began gathering their forces. Messengers rode throughout Sindh calling warriors to arms. By mid-February 1843, an army had assembled near the village of Miani, about 6 miles from Hyderabad. This army numbered approximately 22,000 men, including cavalry, infantry, and some artillery. It was a formidable force, one of the largest armies fielded by any Indian power in the 1840s. The warriors were motivated, fighting to defend their homeland against foreign invasion. They took up a strong defensive position along a dried riverbed called the Fuleli, which provided a natural obstacle with steep banks that would make attacking them difficult. They planted their banners, prepared their weapons, and waited for the British to come. Napier had about 2,800 men under his command. His force included the 22nd Regiment, also known as the Cheshire Regiment, one of the British Army's regular infantry units with a distinguished combat record. He also had the 25th Native Infantry and the 12th Native Infantry, units composed of Indian soldiers commanded by British officers known as sepoys. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and experienced. He had a few companies of cavalry, both British and Indian, and 12 artillery pieces, a mix of field guns and howitzers. This was not a large force by European standards, and it was dwarfed by the enemy army waiting at Miani. Any conventional military assessment would have said that Napier should wait for reinforcements or try to negotiate. Napier had no intention of doing either. On February 17, 1843, Napier marched his forces toward Miani. The day was brutally hot, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The British and Indian troops wearing heavy woolen uniforms designed for European climates suffered intensely from the heat. They marched through dust that coated their throats and blinded their eyes. Water was scarce. Men began to collapse from heat exhaustion, but Napier drove them forward. He knew that delay would give the enemy time to strengthen their position, or for more warriors to join them. He wanted to fight now, while he still had the initiative and before the emirs could fully coordinate their forces. As they approached the enemy position, Napier rode ahead with a few staff officers to personally reconnoiter the emir's army. This was extraordinarily risky. If enemy cavalry had spotted him and realized who he was, they could have captured or killed the British commander before the battle even began. But Napier needed to see the enemy position with his own eyes to understand the terrain and find any weakness he could exploit. He spent hours observing through his telescope, studying the emir's formations, the depth of the dried riverbed, the positions of their artillery, the distribution of their forces along the line. His officers urged him to pull back, worried that they would be spotted. Napier ignored them, continuing his observation until he had seen everything he needed to see. What Napier identified was a critical weakness in the emir's position. The dried riverbed curved, creating an angle where two sections of their line met. This angle formed a salient, a point that jutted forward slightly from the main defensive line. If Napier could get his forces to that angle, they could potentially fire into both sections of the enemy line simultaneously, creating a crossfire that would be devastating. The angle was also the boundary between forces commanded by different emirs, which might mean less coordination in defending it. This was the weak point Napier had been looking for. He would concentrate his entire force against that single point, overwhelming it with firepower and breaking through. It was risky because it meant his troops would have to advance across open ground under fire, then descend into and climb out of the riverbed while under attack from both sides. But Napier believed it was the only way to overcome the massive numerical disadvantage. He assembled his troops and gave them their orders. They would advance in column formation directly toward the angle in the enemy line. They would ignore casualties from enemy fire and maintain their formation. When they reached the riverbed, they would descend in order, reform at the bottom, then assault up the far bank with bayonets. The artillery would provide covering fire, targeting the enemy formations on both sides of the angle. The cavalry would remain in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. The orders were simple, which was deliberate. In the confusion and smoke of battle, complicated orders would be impossible to execute. Simple, clear instructions gave the troops the best chance of maintaining cohesion and executing the plan. Then Napier did something that would become legendary among his troops. He mounted his horse and rode to the very front of the column, positioning himself where every soldier could see him. He would personally lead the advance, exposing himself to enemy fire alongside his men. This was not expected of generals in the 1840s. Senior commanders typically directed battles from safer positions, using aides to carry orders to subordinate officers. Napier was going to lead from the front in the most dangerous position at age 60. When some of his officers objected, concerned for his safety, Napier told them that the troops needed to see their commander sharing their danger. He understood the psychology of leadership, that soldiers fight harder when they know their officers are taking the same risks they are. The advance began in mid-afternoon. The British columns moved forward across the dusty plain, drums beating time, colors flying, maintaining perfect parade ground formation despite the heat and the knowledge that they were marching into battle against an army 8 times their size. As they came within range, the emir's forces opened fire. Musket balls began striking the ranks. Artillery shot tore through the columns. Men fell, the wounded cried out, blood stained the dust. But the columns kept advancing, closing ranks as men fell, maintaining formation and discipline. This was what all the drilling and training was for. To maintain cohesion under fire, to keep moving forward even as comrades died around you. Napier rode at the front, completely exposed, making himself the most visible target on the battlefield. Enemy marksmen aimed at him, specifically trying to kill the British commander. Musket balls whistled past him. His horse was struck, but he kept riding. It seemed impossible that he would survive the advance, but survive he did, untouched, despite being under concentrated fire for nearly 20 minutes. To the British and Indian soldiers following him, it must have seemed like proof of divine protection or extraordinary luck. Their general was invincible, riding calmly through enemy fire as if it could not touch him. The effect on morale was electric. If their general could do this, they could do it too. The columns reached the edge of the dried riverbed. Now came the most difficult part. They had to descend the steep banks 15 to 20 feet down while under fire from above. The formations broke as men scrambled down, using hands and feet to negotiate the slope. For several minutes, the British force was completely vulnerable, scattered across the banks and the bottom of the riverbed, unable to maintain formation or return fire effectively. The Emir's warriors saw their opportunity and surged forward to attack. Thousands of men rushing toward the riverbed to crush the British while they were disorganized. This was the critical moment of the battle. If the British and Indian troops could not reform their lines quickly, they would be overwhelmed and slaughtered in the confined space of the riverbed. British officers and sergeants, the backbone of the army's discipline, immediately began shouting orders, physically pushing men into position, reforming the lines even as enemy warriors poured down the banks. Within minutes, incredibly, the British had established a defensive formation at the bottom of the riverbed. Ranks of infantry formed up, loaded their rifles, fixed bayonets. When the first wave of Emir's warriors reached them, they met not scattered soldiers, but organized ranks ready to fight. The fighting became brutal and close quarters. The confined space of the riverbed meant there was no room for maneuver, no possibility of cavalry charges or artillery bombardment. It was infantry against infantry, bayonets and rifle butts against swords and spears, men grappling hand to hand. The 22nd Regiment, the British infantry at the center of the line, faced the heaviest fighting. Wave after wave of warriors attacked them, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers and courage. The fighting was so close that soldiers could see their enemies' faces, could hear their shouts and war cries, could smell blood and gunpowder and sweat in the confined space. But the British discipline held. The soldiers had been trained for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. They fought in ranks, supporting each other, the front rank firing and then stepping back to reload while the second rank stepped forward. They used their bayonets with devastating efficiency, the long blades giving them a reach advantage over swords. When warriors tried to rush the line, they met a wall of bayonets that cut them down. The British soldiers were also equipped with percussion cap rifles, which were more reliable and faster to reload than the matchlock muskets used by most of the Emir's forces. This gave them a critical advantage in the sustained firefight. The Indian sepoy regiments, the 25th and 12th Native Infantry, fought with equal discipline and courage. These were professional soldiers who took pride in their regiments and their combat record. They held their sections of the line against repeated attacks, maintaining formation and cohesion. The fact that Indian soldiers were fighting against other Indians in service of the British Empire was not unusual in this period. The British Indian Army recruited from specific communities and regions, creating unit identities that often superseded broader ethnic or national loyalties. These sepoys were fighting for their regiment, for their honor, for their officers, not necessarily for the British Empire as an abstract concept. Napier's artillery, positioned on the edges of the riverbed where they could fire down into the enemy formations, provided crucial support. The gunners worked their pieces with practiced efficiency, loading and firing as fast as possible, sending canister shot tearing through the packed masses of warriors. Canister shot was essentially a tin can filled with musket balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun, devastating at close range. The 12 British guns, though heavily outnumbered by the Emir's forces, inflicted disproportionate casualties because of superior training and positioning. The British gunners could fire 3 or 4 times as fast as less trained artillery crews, and their aim was more accurate. For over an hour, the battle raged in the riverbed with neither side gaining decisive advantage. The Emir's warriors fought with tremendous courage, attacking again and again despite heavy casualties. They were defending their homeland, fighting against foreign invaders, and their motivation was strong. But courage without organization and modern tactics was not enough against the British discipline. Slowly, painfully, the British and Indian troops began to push forward, climbing up the far bank of the riverbed, establishing positions on the top where they could fire down into the enemy forces. Napier personally directed the most critical movements, riding along the line despite the danger, ordering units forward at key moments, shifting reserves to threaten key points. His presence was everywhere, inspiring his troops and coordinating the attack. He seemed to have complete awareness of the entire battlefield, understanding where pressure needed to be applied and where his line needed reinforcing. This was the mark of a great tactical commander, the ability to understand the flow of battle and make decisions in real time that exploit opportunities and prevent disasters. Once British troops gained the high ground on the far bank of the riverbed, the dynamics of the battle shifted. Now they could fire down into the Emir's forces, and their position at the angle meant they could create a crossfire, exactly as Napier had planned. The warriors who had been attacking them were now caught between 2 directions of fire, taking casualties from multiple angles. The Emir's commanders tried to adjust their formations, but the confusion and smoke made coordination nearly impossible. Different sections of their army were fighting separate battles with little communication between them. The British pressed their advantage. Fresh troops who had been held in reserve moved forward, widening the breakthrough. The artillery shifted position, moving forward to continue providing support. The disciplined advance continued meter by meter, pushing the enemy back. After 2 hours of continuous fighting, the Emir's line began to waver. Small groups began to retreat, looking for safer positions. Officers tried to rally them, but the momentum had shifted. What had been an organized offense was becoming disorganized resistance. Napier saw the moment when the enemy line would break. He ordered his cavalry forward. The cavalry squadrons had been waiting, positioned where they could not see much of the fighting but could hear it, knowing their moment would come. Now they charged forward, riding over the battlefield, catching the Emir's forces as they began to retreat. Cavalry are at their most effective against troops who are already demoralized and breaking formation. Against organized infantry, cavalry charges can be suicidal, horses and riders cut down by mass fire. But against retreating disorganized troops, cavalry can inflict catastrophic casualties. The Emir's army broke. What had been a retreat became a rout. Thousands of warriors fleeing across the plain, pursued by British and Indian cavalry. The organized army that had defended the riverbed position dissolved into scattered groups, trying to escape. The cavalry rode through them, cutting down anyone they caught. This was the most brutal part of the battle, when most of the casualties occurred. The actual fighting in the riverbed had been intense, but relatively contained. The pursuit was a massacre. 5,000 of the Emir's soldiers were killed, most of them during the retreat and pursuit. The British and Indian cavalry showed no mercy, cutting down fleeing men who no longer posed a threat. This was standard military practice in the 19th century, when pursuing and destroying a defeated enemy was considered essential to prevent them from reorganizing. When the fighting finally ended, Napier surveyed the battlefield. Bodies were everywhere, most of them warriors from the Emir's army. The British had lost 62 men killed and 194 wounded. This casualty ratio, 8-to-1 in favor of the British, seems almost impossible. How could 2,800 men defeat 22,000 and suffer such light casualties in the process? The answer lies in the combination of factors that Napier had assembled: superior tactics, better training, more effective weapons, disciplined formations, and brilliant battlefield command. Each of these factors individually would have provided some advantage. Combined, they created an overwhelming force multiplication effect. But the battle also demonstrated the harsh reality of 19th century colonial warfare. The technological and organizational gap between European militaries and traditional armies had become enormous. Armies that would have been formidable opponents a century earlier were now at catastrophic disadvantage against modern military forces. The warriors at Miani fought with courage equal to any soldiers in history. They were brave. They were motivated. They were defending their homes. But bravery was not enough. They faced an enemy with better weapons, better organization, better tactics, and years of professional military training. The Battle of Miani was not won because the British soldiers were braver or more determined, but because they had advantages in nearly every aspect of military effectiveness. The aftermath of the battle was chaotic. The Emir's army had been destroyed, but the Emirs themselves had mostly survived and fled Hyderabad. The main city of Sindh was now defenseless. Napier marched on the city expecting it to surrender. Instead, he found that some of the Emirs wanted to continue resistance. Messages were sent, negotiations attempted, but Napier had no patience for prolonged diplomacy. He had won a decisive battle and intended to capitalize on that victory immediately. He surrounded Hyderabad and prepared to assault it if necessary. The city's defenders, demoralized by the defeat at Miani and overwhelmed by Napier's aggressive advance, chose not to fight. Hyderabad surrendered without significant resistance, but the conquest was not complete. Some of the Emirs had escaped with portions of their forces intact. They retreated north toward other cities and fortifications, hoping to gather more warriors and continue the resistance. Napier knew he could not allow them time to reorganize. Despite his troops being exhausted from the battle and the march, despite the crushing heat, he pushed them forward. Speed was essential. If he gave the Emirs time to rally support, if he allowed them to present the defeat at Miani as just one battle rather than a decisive campaign, the war might drag on for months. Napier wanted to end this quickly with overwhelming force and continuous pressure. Within weeks, Napier received intelligence that another army was forming, this one near Duba, close to the city of Hyderabad. This force numbered about 20,000 men, not quite as large as the army at Miani, but still substantial. Once again, Napier was outnumbered by approximately 7-1. Once again, his officers urged caution. Once again, he ignored them and ordered an immediate attack. On March 24, 1843, just over 5 weeks after the Battle of Miani, Napier fought the Battle of Hyderabad, also known as the Battle of Duba. The second battle followed a pattern similar to the first. The Emir's forces held a strong defensive position. They had learned from Miani and tried to prepare better defenses. They positioned their artillery more effectively and tried to avoid creating vulnerable angles in their line. But they were still fighting with the same disadvantages: less effective weapons, less training, less coordination. Napier used tactics similar to those at Miani, studying the enemy position, identifying a weak point, concentrating his force against it, and attacking with disciplined aggression. The fighting at Duba was, if anything, more intense than at Miani. The Emir's forces knew this was likely their last chance to stop the British conquest. They fought with desperate courage, launching repeated counterattacks, trying to break the British lines through sheer determination. The battle raged for several hours, with close quarters fighting that tested the discipline of Napier's troops to their limits. But once again, British discipline and firepower prevailed. The Emir's army was defeated, suffering thousands of casualties. British losses were again remarkably light, fewer than 300 casualties total. With the defeat at Duba, organized military resistance in Sindh collapsed. The remaining Emirs either fled or sought terms with the British. Some escaped to neighboring territories. Others surrendered and were placed under British protection, essentially under house arrest. Napier declared Sindh annexed to the British Empire. In just 5 weeks, with 2 major battles and a handful of smaller skirmishes, he had conquered an entire country. The speed and decisiveness of the conquest were extraordinary, even by the standards of colonial warfare. Now comes perhaps the most famous part of the Sindh story, and it reveals something important about how history and legend intertwine. According to popular history, after conquering Sindh, Napier sent a one-word telegram to his superiors in Kolkata, Pekavi. This is Latin for "I have sinned." But it is also in spoken English a pun on "I have sinned," one word that was simultaneously a confession of moral guilt and an announcement of military victory. It is clever, literate, and perfectly captures the moral ambiguity of what Napier had done. It became one of the most famous military communications in history, cited in countless books and articles as an example of British wit and the complex relationship between empire and conscience. There is just one problem with this famous anecdote. It almost certainly never happened. The earliest known reference to the Peccavi dispatch appeared not in military records or contemporary accounts, but in the humour magazine Punch in May 1843. It was submitted by a 17-year-old girl named Catherine Winkworth as a satirical joke about the Sindh conquest. The magazine published it as a humorous piece making fun of both imperial conquest and learned classical references. It was satire, not history. But the joke was so perfect, so seemingly characteristic of Napier's personality and the situation, that people began to believe it was real. The story spread throughout Britain and eventually entered the historical record as if it were fact. Did Napier actually send the dispatch? Almost certainly not. There is no evidence of it in official military communications or in Napier's own extensive journals and letters. The only source is a satirical magazine article written by a teenager. Yet the story persists because it feels true, because it captures something essential about Napier and about the British Imperial project more broadly. A general who recognized the moral questionability of conquest, but did it anyway. Who was clever and educated enough to make Latin puns about his own actions. Who represented that peculiar Victorian mixture of moral consciousness and imperial ambition. The fact that people believed Napier would send such a dispatch, even if he didn't, tells us something about his reputation and the complex attitudes toward empire in Victorian Britain. Napier himself, when he heard about the Punch article, never publicly denied the story. He may have found it amusing. He may have appreciated that it captured his complex feelings about the conquest, or he may simply not have cared enough to correct the record. Whatever his reasons, his silence allowed the legend to grow. By the time of his death, the Peccavi dispatch was widely believed to be real, and it has been repeated in history books ever since, despite the lack of evidence. It is a perfect example of how historical legends are born and how they can eclipse actual history. The real response to the conquest in Britain was mixed and contentious. Some celebrated it as a brilliant military achievement, as restoration of British prestige after the Afghan disaster. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines about Napier's victories. He was hailed as a hero, living proof that British arms could still win decisive victories. The military establishment, whatever their personal reservations about Napier's aggressive personality, had to acknowledge his tactical brilliance. 2 victories against overwhelming odds, minimal casualties, rapid conquest. By purely military standards, it was a masterpiece, but there was also significant criticism. Some members of Parliament questioned whether the conquest had been necessary or legal. The existing treaties with the emirs had supposedly guaranteed their independence. Had the emirs really violated these treaties seriously enough to justify conquest? Or had the British manufactured a crisis to provide an excuse for aggression? A parliamentary investigation was launched. Testimonies were taken from officials involved in the Sindh affair. Napier's correspondence was examined. The treaty violations claimed by the British were scrutinized. What emerged was a messy picture. The emirs had not been perfect treaty partners. There had been incidents, border violations, disputes about payments and obligations, but nothing that clearly rose to the level of justifying conquest and annexation. The attack on the British residency in Hyderabad, the immediate trigger for the war, appeared to have been a relatively minor incident that Napier had used as a pretext for an invasion he had already been planning. The investigation concluded somewhat equivocally that while Napier may have exceeded his strict authority, and while the conquest may not have been absolutely necessary, it was nonetheless beneficial to British interests and would be allowed to stand. Sindh was now part of the British Empire, and there was no practical way to reverse that. The emirs were not going to be restored to power. Napier was allowed to remain as governor of the conquered province, though he was given a stern warning about exceeding his authority in the future. The investigation was in essence a political compromise. The critics got their investigation and their public airing of concerns about imperial overreach. The expansionists got to keep their conquest. Napier got to keep his position while being mildly rebuked for his methods. Napier's personal response to the criticism was typically defiant. In his journals and in letters to friends, he defended his actions. He argued that the strategic necessity of securing the frontier justified the conquest. He claimed that the people of Sindh would be better off under British rule than under the emirs. He pointed to his administrative reforms as evidence that he was improving conditions in the province. But he also, in his more reflective moments, acknowledged the moral cost. He wrote that he had committed what he called a useful crime, a wrong act that served a greater good. This phrase encapsulates his entire moral position. Yes, the conquest was wrong, but it was necessary and beneficial and therefore justified. This kind of moral reasoning is fascinating from a historical perspective because it shows how intelligent, thoughtful people convinced themselves that imperial conquest was acceptable. Napier was not a simple villain who enjoyed violence and domination. He was a complex person who genuinely believed he was improving the world, who thought that British civilization was superior and should be spread, who convinced himself that the short-term violence and injustice of conquest would be redeemed by long-term benefits. Whether you find this reasoning convincing or repellent probably depends on your broader views about imperialism, about whether ends justify means, about whether cultural superiority, even if real, grants the right to conquer and rule others. As governor of Sindh, Napier implemented an extensive reform program. He built roads throughout the province, improving transportation and trade. He established a more systematic legal system, replacing the previous patchwork of local customs and emir's arbitrary justice with British-style courts and codified laws. He worked to suppress practices he found morally abhorrent, particularly sati, the practice of burning widows alive on their husbands' funeral pyres, which was still practiced in some parts of Sindh. He established schools and encouraged education. He built irrigation systems to improve agriculture. He tried to reduce the corruption that had been endemic under the emir's rule. By Victorian imperial standards, he was a relatively enlightened administrator who genuinely tried to improve conditions for the ordinary people under his rule. But enlightened imperialism is still imperialism. The people of Sindh had not asked for British rule, British roads, British legal systems, or British ideas about how society should be organized. They had been conquered and were now being reformed according to foreign ideas about what constituted progress and civilization. Napier's reforms were imposed from above by a foreign conqueror, not developed organically by the people themselves. Some of his reforms were genuinely beneficial, improving public health, reducing some forms of oppression, creating economic opportunities. Others were more questionable, disrupting traditional social structures and ways of life without fully replacing them with something better. The impact was mixed and varied, depending on who you were and what you valued. Napier also had to deal with ongoing resistance. The conquest may have been militarily decisive, but not everyone in Sindh accepted British rule peacefully. There were uprisings and rebellions, particularly in the more remote areas where British control was weaker. Tribal groups that had semi-autonomous status under the emirs resisted integration into the British system. Napier conducted several punitive expeditions, sending troops to suppress rebellions and enforce British authority. These expeditions were often brutal, using overwhelming force to crush resistance and deter future uprisings. This was standard practice in colonial governance. Initial conquest followed by years of pacification operations against groups that refused to submit. The Sindh conquest had broader strategic implications for the British Empire in India. It secured the northwestern frontier, providing a buffer zone against potential threats from Afghanistan or beyond. Control of the Indus River gave the British a crucial transportation route for moving troops and supplies. The rapid and decisive nature of the conquest sent a message to other Indian rulers. Resistance to British demands would be crushed quickly and efficiently. This psychological impact may have been as important as the territorial gain. After the humiliation in Afghanistan, the British needed to demonstrate that they were still the dominant military power in the region. The Sindh conquest did exactly that. The conquest also demonstrated the effectiveness of aggressive forward policy in imperial expansion. Rather than waiting for clear threats or unambiguous provocations, the British could identify strategic objectives and then create conditions that justified achieving them. This proactive approach to empire building would be used repeatedly in the following decades. The tactics developed in Sindh, intelligence gathering, exploitation of internal divisions, manufactured crisis, rapid military action, immediate administrative consolidation, became a template for colonial expansion elsewhere. In this sense, Sindh was not just a single conquest, but a demonstration of methods that would be used throughout the British Empire. From a military history perspective, the Sindh campaign remains a fascinating case study in how to overcome numerical disadvantage through superior tactics, discipline, and leadership. Modern militaries still study Napier's tactics at Miani, particularly his identification of the enemy's weak point, his concentration of force, and his maintenance of cohesion under fire. The battle demonstrates fundamental principles that remain relevant. Know your enemy and the terrain. Identify their weakness, concentrate your strength against it. Maintain discipline and coordination. Exploit success aggressively. These are timeless concepts in warfare. What made Napier remarkable was how effectively he applied all of these principles simultaneously in an extremely difficult situation. The campaign also illustrates the growing military gap between European and non-European forces in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution was producing weapons and military technologies that gave European armies enormous advantages. Percussion cap rifles that were more reliable and faster to reload, artillery with better range and accuracy, modern logistics that could supply armies in remote regions, professional officer corps trained in military science, standing armies with standardized training and discipline. All of these advantages combined to create a military superiority that allowed relatively small European forces to defeat much larger traditional armies. This superiority would persist until the mid-20th century when anti-colonial movements gained access to modern weapons and training, finally beginning to even the playing field. Napier's later career was less dramatic, but still notable. He continued to serve as governor of Sindh for several years, consolidating British rule and implementing his reforms. He was later offered command of British forces during the Crimean War, but declined, citing his age and declining health. He was in his 70s by then, and recognized that commanding an army in a major European war would be beyond his physical capabilities. He died in 1853 at his home in England, 10 years after his conquest of Sindh. He was buried with military honors, his coffin draped with the flags he had captured in his campaigns. His reputation at his death was mixed, celebrated as a brilliant commander and effective administrator, but also controversial for his aggressive methods and questionable justification for conquest. His legacy is complex and contested. From a military perspective, he was undoubtedly brilliant. His victories at Miani and Duba demonstrated tactical genius and personal courage. His administrative reforms in Sindh were relatively enlightened by Victorian standards and brought some genuine improvements. But he was also an instrument of imperialism, a conqueror who subdued a people who wanted to remain independent, who manufactured a crisis to justify conquest, who used overwhelming force against weaker opponents. Any assessment of Napier has to grapple with this complexity, acknowledging both his abilities and the imperial system he served. The city of Karachi, which was a small fishing town when Napier arrived, grew into one of the largest cities in South Asia, partly because of British development during and after his governorship. The port facilities he expanded became a major hub for trade. The roads and railways he initiated connected Sindh to the broader British Indian economy. The administrative systems he established shaped the development of the region for over a century. When British India was partitioned in 1947 and Sindh became part of Pakistan, it bore the indelible imprint of Napier's conquest and governance. In a very direct sense, the modern Sindh province exists because of decisions made by Charles Napier in 1843. The human cost of the conquest is harder to quantify, but no less real. Thousands died in the battles and in the pacification campaigns that followed. Families were disrupted. Traditional power structures were destroyed. People who had lived under one system their entire lives suddenly found themselves under foreign rule, with foreign laws and foreign ideas about how society should work. Some adapted successfully, finding new opportunities in the British system. Others suffered, losing status, land, or livelihood. The experience varied enormously depending on individual circumstances. But for most people in Sindh, the conquest was a traumatic disruption of their lives. The Sindh conquest also raises broader questions about historical judgment and moral assessment. How do we evaluate historical figures who were products of their time, who held beliefs that we now find abhorrent, but who also demonstrated remarkable abilities? Napier believed in the superiority of British civilization and the right of Britain to rule over other peoples. By modern standards, these are racist and imperialist beliefs that we rightly reject. But he also believed in many principles we would approve of: opposition to corruption, support for education, concern for the welfare of ordinary people, opposition to practices like sati that treated human beings as property. He was thoughtful, self-aware, and honestly troubled by some of his actions. Does this complexity make him more admirable or just more culpable because he knew better? There is no easy answer to this question. History is full of people like Napier, individuals who are neither heroes nor villains, but complicated human beings acting within the constraints and worldviews of their times. Understanding them requires us to acknowledge both their accomplishments and their complicity in injustice, to see them as products of their historical moment, while also recognizing their individual agency and responsibility. Napier chose to conquer Sindh, even while recognizing that the conquest was morally questionable. That choice and its consequences are his historical legacy. The story of the Sindh conquest also reminds us that empires are not built through abstract forces or inevitable historical processes, but through the specific decisions and actions of individuals. The British Empire in India was created by people like Napier, ambitious soldiers and administrators who saw opportunities and seized them, who pushed boundaries and exceeded their authority, who used violence and coercion to achieve strategic objectives. Understanding how empires actually work requires understanding these human dynamics. The mix of ambition, ideology, strategic calculation, and moral compromise that drove imperial expansion. The conquest had lasting impacts on British military thinking and imperial policy. The speed and efficiency of the campaign became a model for future operations. The tactics Napier developed influenced how the British Army approached colonial warfare for decades. The administrative systems he established became templates used elsewhere in the empire. In this sense, Sindh was not just one conquest among many, but a formative experience that shaped British imperial practice more broadly. The methods that worked in Sindh were tried in other locations, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. For the people of Sindh, the conquest marked a fundamental turning point. They went from being subjects of local rulers, however imperfect those rulers might have been, to being subjects of a distant empire that viewed them as inferiors to be governed and civilized. This transition was not unique to Sindh. It was happening throughout Asia, Africa, and the Pacific in the 19th century as European powers expanded their control. But each instance had its own particular character, its own local consequences. In Sindh, the conquest came suddenly and was executed with remarkable efficiency. There was no long period of gradual influence or ambiguous status. 1 month Sindh was independent, the next it was firmly under British control. This speed may have reduced the immediate bloodshed, but it also meant there was no time for adjustment or negotiation. The various amirs who ruled Sindh before the conquest had different fates. Some were pensioned off by the British, given allowances but stripped of real power. They lived out their lives in comfortable captivity, honored in public but politically neutered. Others went into exile, fleeing to neighboring territories where they tried to maintain some semblance of their former status. A few died in poverty, their wealth confiscated, their families scattered. The traditional elite of Sindh was effectively destroyed as a political class, replaced by British administrators and local collaborators who were willing to work within the colonial system. This pattern, too, was typical of colonial conquest. The existing power structure was either co-opted or eliminated, and replaced with something that served imperial interests. Looking at the Sindh campaign from the perspective of historical memory, it is interesting how the story has been remembered differently in different places. In Britain, Sindh is largely forgotten except by military historians. It was one conquest among many, overshadowed by more dramatic events like the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the Afghan Wars. Napier is not a household name in Britain today, but in Pakistan, in Sindh province, the story is remembered differently. Napier is seen as a conqueror. His name is associated with foreign domination. The battles of Miani and Duba are remembered as resistance against imperial aggression. The same events that British military historians celebrate as tactical brilliance are remembered in Pakistan as national trauma. This divergence of memory is common with colonial history. What one side celebrates as achievement, the other remembers as oppression. The strategic value of Sindh to British India proved, enduring throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th. Sindh remained an important part of British defensive strategy for the northwestern frontier. It served as a staging area for operations in Afghanistan. The port of Karachi became one of the most important in the British Empire. The agricultural resources of the Indus Valley fed British military and economic needs. From the British perspective, Napier's conquest paid strategic dividends for over a century. Whether those strategic benefits justified the violence and subjugation of the conquest is a moral question rather than a strategic one, and different people will answer it differently based on their values and perspectives. For students of military history, the Sindh campaign offers lessons that remain relevant. The importance of reconnaissance and intelligence cannot be overstated. Napier's detailed knowledge of the terrain, the enemy forces, and local conditions gave him decisive advantages. Modern military forces invest heavily in intelligence for exactly this reason. The principle of concentrating force at the decisive point, which Napier demonstrated at Miani, remains a fundamental concept in military strategy. The value of discipline and training, which allowed Napier's troops to maintain cohesion under extremely difficult conditions, continues to be a priority for professional militaries. The psychological dimension of leadership, demonstrated by Napier's courage in leading from the front, reminds us that military effectiveness depends not just on weapons and tactics, but on morale and motivation. The campaign also illustrates the limits of purely military approaches. Napier could win battles decisively, but winning battles did not immediately translate to stable control. Years of pacification operations were needed after the initial conquest. Resistance continued in various forms. Military victory created a situation that required sustained political and administrative effort to consolidate. This pattern has been repeated throughout history. Military conquest is often the easy part. Governing conquered territories is much harder. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine emphasizes this reality, recognizing that military force alone cannot create lasting stability or legitimate governance. Napier understood this to some degree, which is why he put so much effort into administrative reforms. But even his efforts could not completely overcome the fundamental illegitimacy of foreign rule imposed by conquest.